never believed in any of that stuff before. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I thought it was all nonsense. Just stories people made up for attention or to sell books. But after what happened to me last winter in the mountains of northern Idaho, I can't deny what I saw anymore. I'm sharing this because I need people to know the truth, even if they think I'm crazy. It was February 2024, and I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for months. I'm an experienced hiker, been doing it for over 15 years, and I wanted to challenge myself with a winter trek through some of the most remote wilderness in the country. The area I chose was about 60 miles northeast of Coeur d'Alene, deep in the Selkirk Mountains. It's the kind of place where you can hike for days without seeing another soul. I packed enough supplies for a week, loaded up my truck, and drove the winding forest roads until they became impassable. From there, I strapped on my snowshoes and started the long trek into the backcountry. The plan was simple: hike about 20 miles in, set up a base camp, and spend a few days exploring the area before heading back. The first day went perfectly. The weather was crisp, but not brutal, maybe around 15 degrees with clear skies. The snow was deep, at least 3 feet in most places, but my snowshoes handled it fine. I made good time and found a decent spot to camp near a frozen creek. That first night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind through the pine trees and the occasional crack of ice settling. It was peaceful. The second morning started normal enough. I broke camp early and decided to explore a ridge that looked promising from my map. The terrain was challenging but manageable, and I was feeling good about the hike. That's when I found the first footprint. I was crossing a small clearing when I noticed it in the snow about 20 yards ahead. At first, I thought it might be from a moose or elk, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The print was huge, at least 18 inches long and maybe 8 inches wide. But it wasn't shaped like any animal track I'd ever seen. It looked almost human, but way too big. The toes were clearly defined, and you could see where whatever made it had pressed deep into the snow. I stood there staring at it for probably 10 minutes, trying to rationalize what I was looking at. Maybe it was an old track that had melted and refrozen, making it look bigger than it really was. Maybe someone was out here wearing some kind of weird snowshoes. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. The print was fresh, no more than a few hours old based on how clean the edges were. I took some photos with my camera and kept hiking, but the excitement I'd felt earlier was gone. Now I was constantly scanning the tree line, looking for movement. Every shadow seemed suspicious. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Over the next 2 days, I found more prints. They followed a rough north-south pattern through the forest, always in the deepest snow where the trees provided cover. Sometimes there would be a single track, other times I'd find a line of them stretching for 50 yards before disappearing into rocky areas where the snow was thinner. But the footprints weren't the strangest part. On the third day, I started noticing other things. Tree branches broken off at heights that didn't make sense. 10, 12 feet up, snapped clean through. These weren't old breaks from storms or fallen trees. The wood was fresh, and the way they were twisted suggested something incredibly strong had grabbed them and torn them apart. I found scratches on tree trunks too, deep gouges in the bark, way higher than any bear could reach, and bears should have been hibernating anyway. These marks looked deliberate, like something had been marking territory. The scratches were always in sets of 4 or 5 parallel lines, and they cut deep enough to reach the white wood underneath. That night, I made camp in a small grove of pine trees that felt more sheltered than my previous spots. I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy about being out there alone. As I was setting up my tent, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it went on too long and had too much variation to be weather. Then it changed into something that sounded almost like a howl, but deeper and more guttural than any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the mountains. Until I couldn't tell where it originated, I stood completely still, listening. For maybe 30 seconds, the forest was silent. Then I heard it again, coming from a different direction this time. Something was definitely out there, and it sounded big. And the fourth day brought the discovery that really shook me up. I was following what looked like a game trail when I noticed a dark opening in a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was the entrance to a cave. Not huge, but big enough for a person to walk into without ducking. I probably should have turned around right then, but curiosity got the better of me and I decided to take a quick look inside. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped through the entrance. The smell hit me immediately. It was rank, like wet fur mixed with rotting meat and something else I couldn't identify. The kind of smell that makes you want to cover your nose and back away. But I forced myself to take a few more steps in. The cave went back further than I expected, maybe 40 feet before curving out of sight. The floor was covered with a layer of pine needles and what looked like animal bones. Deer mostly, but some I couldn't identify. In one corner there was a pile of what looked like bedding material, branches, moss, and chunks of bark all matted together into something resembling a nest. But what really got my attention were the scratch marks on the walls. They were everywhere, carved deep into the rock. Some looked random, but others seemed almost intentional, like primitive drawings or symbols. And they were all at heights that made no sense for any normal animal. What disturbed me even more was finding what looked like partially chewed bones scattered around the nest area. Some still had meat clinging to them, and the bite marks were unlike anything I'd seen before. Too big for a wolf, too precise for a bear. The teeth that had made these marks were enormous and arranged in a pattern that seemed almost human-like. I was examining one of the larger bones when I heard something that made my blood freeze. From deeper in the cave, beyond where my flashlight could reach, came a low breathing sound. Deep, rhythmic, like something large was sleeping back there in the darkness. I backed toward the entrance, trying not to make any noise, when I heard rocks shifting outside. My heart hammered as I clicked off my flashlight and pressed myself against the cave wall. Through the entrance, I could see a large shadow moving across the snow. Whatever it was huge and walking upright. The breathing from the back of the cave had stopped. Whatever was deeper in there had woken up, and I could hear it moving around in the darkness. I was trapped between something outside and something behind me, both of which sounded far too large to be anything I wanted to encounter. I held my breath and waited. The shadow paused right outside the cave entrance for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, it moved away. I stayed pressed against that wall for another 10 minutes, listening to occasional sounds from the depths of the cave, before I worked up the courage to look outside. The area was empty, but there were fresh tracks in the snow, the same massive footprints I'd been finding, but these were right outside the cave. Whatever had made them had been standing just feet away from where I was hiding. And whatever had been breathing in the back of the cave had gone completely silent. As I hurried away from that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that there had been more than one of them. The thought that these creatures might live in groups, might have families or communities hidden in these remote mountains, made everything 10 times more terrifying. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent sent adrenaline shooting through my system. The wind moving through branches sounded like footsteps. Settling snow sounded like breathing. I kept my flashlight ready and my bear spray within reach, though I was starting to doubt either would be much help against whatever was out there. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me sit bolt upright in my sleeping bag. It was the sound of my campsite being investigated. Something was moving around outside my tent, circling it slowly. I could hear the soft crunch of snow with each step, and occasionally the sound of my gear being moved or sniffed. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent wall near my head. I held my breath and listened. For at least 5 minutes, whatever was out there just stood there. I could hear breathing, deep, measured breaths that fogged in the cold air. At one point, I swear I felt pressure against the tent wall, like something was gently pushing against it to test its strength. Then came a sound that nearly made me scream. A low, rumbling vocalization, almost like purring, but much deeper and more guttural. It seemed to come from directly above my tent, as if whatever was making the sound was standing right over me. The sound went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I lay there in complete silence for the rest of the night, too terrified to move. When morning finally came, I found evidence that something had indeed been in my camp. My backpack had been moved several feet from where I'd left it. The snow around my tent was packed down with those massive footprints forming a complete circle. And strangest of all, someone or something had built a small cairn of rocks just 20 feet from my tent while I was sleeping inside. I should have packed up and headed home right then. Looking back, that would have been the smart choice. But I was only 2 days into what was supposed to be a week-long trip. And part of me still wanted to believe there was a rational explanation for everything I'd experienced. That was a mistake. The 5th day, I decided to do some exploring closer to my campsite instead of venturing further into the wilderness. I figured if I stayed in a smaller area, I'd feel more in control of the situation. That turned out to be completely wrong. I was following the frozen creek when I started getting the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you just know someone's eyes are on you? It was like that, but magnified by 100. I kept turning around, scanning the tree line, but I never saw anything definitive. Just occasional movements in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Shadows that seemed to shift when they should have been still. The feeling of being stalked by something that was much better at hiding than I was at spotting it. Around midday, I stopped to eat lunch on a fallen log near the creek. That's when I heard the wood knocking for the first time. It started as 3 sharp raps, like someone hitting a tree with a large stick. The sound echoed through the forest, and after a few seconds, it was answered by similar knocking from a different direction. The pattern continued for several minutes. 3 knocks from one location, answered by 3 knocks from somewhere else. It was clearly some kind of communication, and the locations were moving. Whatever was making the sounds was coordinating, possibly surrounding me. The knocking gradually got closer until it seemed to be coming from just beyond the tree line on both sides of the creek. Then it stopped. The forest went completely silent in a way that felt unnatural. No wind, no bird calls, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just dead silence that seemed to press in on me from all directions. I packed up my lunch as quickly as possible and started moving. But the feeling of being watched intensified. Every few minutes, I'd hear a single knock from somewhere behind me, as if whatever was following me was marking my position for something else. When I found the deer carcass, everything started to make sense in the worst possible way. I was crossing a small clearing when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. On the opposite bank, maybe 50 yards downstream, there was a structure that definitely wasn't natural. Someone, or something, had stacked logs and branches against a large boulder, creating what looked like a crude shelter. The construction was rough but effective, and it was clearly recent. But it wasn't the shelter that made my stomach drop. It was what was hanging from a tree branch next to it. A deer carcass was suspended about 8 feet off the ground, hung by what looked like twisted vines or strips of bark. The animal had been gutted and partially skinned, but not in any way I'd ever seen a hunter dress a kill. The cuts were jagged and uneven, as if it had been torn apart by hand rather than cut with a knife. What made it even more disturbing was how fresh it was. Blood was still dripping from the carcass into the snow below, which meant this kill had happened recently. Very recently, maybe within the last few hours. I crossed the creek to get a better look, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. Up close, the shelter was even more impressive. The logs were huge, the kind that would take several people working together to move. But there were no tool marks, no evidence of ropes or machinery. It looked like everything had been placed by brute strength alone. Inside the shelter, I found more of those bone piles and the same rank smell from the cave. There were also chunks of bark that had been stripped from trees and arranged like primitive bedding. But what really disturbed me were the claw marks on the inside walls of the shelter. Deep gouges in the wood that looked like they'd been made by fingernails, except no human fingernails were that thick or that strong. That's when I realized the wood knocking had started again, but this time it was much closer, and it wasn't coming from just 2 locations anymore. I could hear it from at least 4 different directions, forming a rough circle around my position. I was being surrounded. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures of the shelter, moving as quickly as possible. But as I was snapping photos, I heard something that made me freeze. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching through snow, getting closer from multiple directions. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a series of low vocalizations that sounded almost like whispered conversations. I couldn't make out any words, but the rhythm and cadence suggested complex communication. Whatever was out there, they were talking to each other about me. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. There was a cluster of large pine trees about 20 yards away that might provide cover, but getting there would mean crossing open ground where I'd be completely exposed. The alternative was to stay near the shelter and hope whatever was coming would lose interest. Then I saw movement through the trees on the far side of the clearing. Something large and dark was moving toward me, still mostly hidden by the forest, but getting closer with each second. The way it moved was wrong, too fluid, too confident, like a predator that knew it had cornered its prey. I made the decision to run for the trees. It was probably the only thing that saved my life. I bolted across the clearing, expecting at any moment to hear those footsteps behind me getting closer. But instead of pursuit, I heard something even more terrifying. Laughter. Deep, rumbling sounds that might have been amusement. Whatever was out there was letting me run because it found my panic entertaining. I pressed myself behind the largest pine tree and tried to control my breathing. Through a gap in the branches, I could see the clearing and the shelter I'd just fled. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then they appeared. 3 of them. 3 massive figures emerged from different points around the clearing, moving with the coordinated precision of a hunting pack. They were all similar to what I'd glimpsed before. 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, walking upright but with a gait that was distinctly non-human. But seeing multiple creatures at once drove home just how intelligent and organized they were. The largest one, which I assumed was the leader, approached the shelter and began examining the area where I'd been standing. It moved with purpose, clearly following my scent trail. The other 2 positioned themselves at opposite sides of the clearing, effectively cutting off any escape routes. What terrified me most was how methodical they were. This wasn't random behavior or simple animal curiosity. They were hunting me, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The leader made a series of clicking sounds, and the other 2 began moving in my direction. They hadn't spotted me yet, but they knew approximately where I was hiding. It was like watching a search and rescue operation, except I was the one who needed rescuing from the rescuers. I realized I had maybe 30 seconds before they found me. The trees I was hiding behind wouldn't provide cover for long, and there was nowhere to run that wouldn't put me in the open. But I still had my camera, and some part of my brain realized this might be the only chance anyone would ever have to document these creatures. My hands were shaking as I raised the camera and managed to take one photograph through the gap in the branches. The largest creature was in perfect profile, clearly visible about 60 yards away. Even through the viewfinder, its size was intimidating. But as soon as the camera's shutter clicked, all three creatures stopped moving and turned toward my position. For a moment, the entire forest seemed frozen. Then the leader let out a vocalization that was unlike anything I'd heard before, a mix of roar and scream that seemed to go right through me. They had found me. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. The three creatures didn't just run toward me, they coordinated their approach like experienced hunters. One came straight at me while the other two circled around to cut off my flanks. I had maybe a 5-second head start before they reached my position. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through snow and underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear them gaining ground with each step. The sounds they made while chasing me were the most terrifying part. It wasn't just the heavy footfalls or the breaking of branches. They were communicating with each other, coordinating their pursuit with a series of calls and responses that sounded almost like a language. I made it maybe 200 yards before I realized I wasn't going to outrun them. My lungs were burning from the cold air, and the deep snow was slowing me down while they seemed to move through it effortlessly. I could hear them getting closer, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they caught me. That's when I spotted the narrow ravine ahead. It was maybe 4 feet wide and looked like it cut deep into the hillside. If I could make it there, the confined space might level the playing field. At least they wouldn't be able to surround me. I changed direction and dove for the ravine just as something massive crashed through the bushes behind me. I felt claws rake across my backpack as I tumbled down the rocky slope, tearing the fabric but missing my body by inches. The ravine was deeper than I'd expected, maybe 15 feet down to a narrow stream bed. I landed hard on the rocky bottom, jarring my shoulder and scraping my hands, but I was alive and temporarily out of reach. Above me, I could hear the creatures moving around the rim of the ravine, looking for a way down. The largest one appeared at the edge directly above me, and for the first time, I got a clear look at its face. It was definitely not human, but it wasn't purely animal either. The features were ape-like, but more refined, more intelligent. The eyes especially seemed to show awareness and problem-solving ability. It was studying the ravine, trying to figure out how to get down to me without getting trapped itself. After a few minutes, the creatures moved away from the ravine edge, but I could still hear them in the forest above. They hadn't given up. They were regrouping and planning their next move. The stream bed led deeper into the hillside toward what looked like a more substantial canyon system. If I could follow it far enough, I might be able to find another way out, or at least put more distance between me and my pursuers. But as I started moving downstream, I heard something that made me stop cold. From somewhere ahead of me, echoing off the canyon walls, came an answering call to the vocalizations I'd been hearing from above. There were more of them, and they were between me and any possible escape route. I was completely surrounded in a ravine with nowhere to run. I was trapped in that ravine for over an hour, listening to the creatures moving around above me and hearing calls from others somewhere downstream. They were patient, methodical, clearly more intelligent than any animal I'd ever encountered. But they also seemed to be waiting for something. That's when I realized what was happening. It was getting dark. During the day, I'd had the advantage of visibility and the ability to see them coming, but as night fell, that advantage would disappear completely. They knew the terrain better than I did, could move more quietly, and probably had much better night vision. They were waiting for darkness to finish what they'd started. I had to make a move while I still had some daylight left. The ravine walls were steep, but not impossible to climb. About 50 yards upstream from where I'd fallen, there was a section where erosion had created a more gradual slope. If I could reach it without being seen, I might be able to climb out on the opposite side from where most of the creatures seemed to be positioned. Moving as quietly as possible, I worked my way upstream along the rocky bottom. Every few steps, I'd pause and listen for movement above, but the forest had gone eerily quiet. That worried me more than the vocalizations had. When predators go silent, it usually means they're preparing to strike. I was almost to the climbing spot when I heard something that made my blood freeze. From directly above me came the sound of breathing, slow and measured. One of them had been following my progress along the rim of the ravine, staying directly overhead as I moved. I looked up and saw a massive silhouette against the darkening sky. It was crouched at the edge of the ravine, watching me. When our eyes met, it made a soft clicking sound, almost like it was amused by my attempted escape. That's when I heard answering clicks from multiple directions. They had all been tracking me, waiting to see what I would do. I was like a mouse in a maze, and they were the cats watching every move I made. The creature above me stood up to its full height and let out a long, complex vocalization that echoed through the canyon. It was clearly some kind of signal, because immediately I heard movement from all directions as the pack began to converge on my position. I didn't have time to be careful anymore. I scrambled up the slope as fast as I could, slipping on loose rocks and scraping my hands raw on the stone. Behind me, I could hear something large dropping down into the ravine. I made it to the top just as powerful hands grabbed at my ankles. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was caught, but my boots slipped off in the creature's grip and I tumbled forward into the underbrush. What followed was the most intense chase of my life. The creatures were no longer being subtle or methodical. They crashed through the forest behind me with single-minded purpose, and I could hear at least 4 of them now, maybe more. I ran blindly through the darkening woods, branches whipping across my face, roots catching my feet. My lungs burned from the cold air and exertion, but terror kept me moving. Every time I thought I might be gaining some distance, I'd hear that coordinated calling behind me, and I knew they were still coming. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw something ahead that gave me hope. The entrance to another cave system, this one much smaller than the ones I'd explored before. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I dove for the entrance just as something massive crashed through the trees behind me. Claws raked across my backpack again, this time tearing it completely off my back. But I managed to squeeze through the opening and tumble into the darkness beyond. The space inside was cramped, more of a crevice than a true cave. I had to crawl on my hands and knees to move deeper into it, but that was exactly what I needed. Nothing as large as those creatures would be able to follow me. Behind me, I could hear them trying to get through the entrance. The sounds of claws scraping against rock, frustrated vocalizations, and what sounded like attempts to dig or widen the opening. But the passage was too narrow, and eventually the sounds stopped. I crawled as far back into the crevice as I could and settled in to wait. I had no idea how long they would stay outside, but I knew I couldn't leave until I was absolutely certain they were gone. What followed were the longest, most terrifying hours of my life. The creatures didn't leave. Instead, they took turns keeping watch outside the cave entrance. I could hear them moving around, sometimes right outside the opening, sometimes further away, but always close enough that I knew escape was impossible. They tried different approaches to get me out. At first, there was the direct assault, attempts to claw or dig their way through the rock. When that failed, they tried what I can only describe as psychological warfare. They would make sounds designed to mimic human voices, calling out things like, "Help me," and "Is anyone there?" in voices that were almost convincing but not quite right. The cadence was off, the pronunciation slightly wrong, like they had learned the words by listening to humans but didn't understand what they meant. Other times they would bang rocks against the cave entrance in complex rhythms, creating patterns that seemed almost musical. I realized they were trying to communicate, possibly attempting to negotiate or trick me into coming out. The most disturbing moments were when they went completely silent. During those periods, I couldn't tell if they had finally left or if they were just waiting patiently outside. The uncertainty was almost worse than the active threats. Around what I guessed was midnight, something changed. The sounds outside became more agitated, with rapid vocalizations between multiple creatures. It sounded like they were arguing or debating something. Then I heard new sounds, the breaking of branches and what sounded like rocks being thrown. They were destroying my campsite. I could hear them tearing apart everything I'd left behind, probably searching for more information about me or just expressing their frustration. The sounds went on for over an hour before things finally went quiet again. I forced myself to wait until I could see daylight filtering through the cave entrance before I even considered leaving. Even then, I spent another hour listening for any signs of movement outside. When I finally worked up the courage to crawl back toward the entrance, I discovered they had left me a message. Arranged in a neat line just outside the cave opening were pieces of my destroyed equipment, my torn backpack, my shredded sleeping bag, my bent tent poles. It was clearly intentional, a demonstration of what they could have done to me if they had gotten their hands on me. But mixed in with the wreckage was something that chilled me to the bone. My camera. It was sitting upright in the snow, completely undamaged despite the destruction around it. They had found it in my backpack and deliberately left it intact. I realized they wanted me to have the photographs I'd taken. They wanted proof of their existence to survive, even if I didn't. The implications of that level of intelligence and planning were terrifying. The moment the camera's shutter clicked, everything changed. The creature's head snapped toward my position, and its posture shifted from curious to aggressive in an instant. It let out a roar that was unlike anything I'd ever heard, part scream, part howl, and completely terrifying. I managed to take one more quick photo as it started charging toward me. Then survival instinct kicked in and I ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. The snow that had slowed me down all week suddenly felt like quicksand as I tried to get away from whatever was behind me. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every step. I made it maybe 50 yards before something slammed into my back and sent me flying face first into the snow. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I couldn't move or breathe. Then massive hands grabbed me and flipped me over. The creature was right on top of me, its face inches from mine. The smell was overwhelming, rank breath and wet fur and something wild and predatory. Its eyes were filled with what I can only describe as rage. It opened its mouth and let out another roar that was so loud and close it made my ears ring. Then it grabbed my left shoulder and squeezed. I felt something pop, and pain shot down my entire arm. I screamed and tried to push it away, but it was like trying to move a mountain. The creature was impossibly strong. It raised one massive hand above my head, and I thought that was it. I was going to die in the middle of nowhere, killed by something that wasn't supposed to exist. But instead of finishing me off, the creature suddenly looked up and around as if it had heard something. Then it released me and backed away. I don't know why it didn't kill me. Maybe it heard another sound that distracted it, or maybe it just lost interest. All I know is that after staring at me for another few seconds, it turned and walked back toward its cave. I lay in the snow for several minutes, too shocked and hurt to move. My left shoulder was definitely dislocated or broken, and I had cuts on my face from being thrown into the snow. But I was alive, and that was more than I'd expected a few minutes earlier. Very slowly, I managed to sit up and look around. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear sounds coming from the direction of its cave. I needed to get out of there before it decided to come back and finish what it had started. That's when I noticed the narrow opening in the rock face about 10 yards to my left. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it looked like it went back into the mountain. If the creature came back, it might be the only place I could hide. Moving as quietly as possible, I crawled toward the opening. My left arm was useless, so I had to pull myself along with just my right hand. Every movement sent waves of pain through my shoulder, but I forced myself to keep going. The opening was even tighter than it looked. I had to remove my backpack and push it ahead of me to get through. But once I was inside, the space opened up into a narrow tunnel that went back about 15 feet before ending in a small chamber. I pulled my backpack in after me and settled in to wait. The tunnel was so narrow that nothing as large as the creature I'd encountered would be able to follow me. At least I hoped it wouldn't be able to. The next 12 hours were the longest of my life. I could hear the creature moving around outside, sometimes very close to my hiding spot. Several times I heard it breathing or making those strange vocalizations right outside the tunnel entrance. Once, I swear I heard it trying to dig or scratch at the rocks around the opening. I didn't dare use my flashlight or make any sound. I just sat in complete darkness, listening and praying that the creature wouldn't find a way to get to me. My shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, and I was starting to worry about hypothermia. But I was too terrified to even think about leaving my hiding spot. Around what I guessed was midnight, the sounds outside finally stopped, but I still didn't move. I forced myself to wait until I could see daylight filtering through the tunnel entrance before I even considered leaving. When morning finally came, I listened carefully for any signs that the creature was still in the area. After hearing nothing for over an hour, I slowly worked my way back through the tunnel. The area outside looked like a war zone. Snow was scattered everywhere, trees were broken, and there were massive footprints all around the entrance to my hiding spot. The creature had definitely been trying to get to me. I gathered my courage and made my way back to where I'd been attacked. My camera was lying in the snow where I'd dropped it, but amazingly it was still intact. The LCD screen was cracked, but when I turned it on, it still worked. Looking at the images I'd captured was surreal. There it was, clear as day, a massive, hair-covered creature that shouldn't exist. The first photo showed it in profile near the creek. The second, taken right before the attack, showed it facing directly toward the camera with what could only be described as an expression of fury. I wanted to take more pictures of the area to document the cave and the evidence of the creature's presence. But I knew I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. If it came back while I was still in the area, I might not be so lucky a second time. The hike out was a nightmare. My shoulder was definitely broken and I could only use one arm. The snow that had been manageable on the way in was now a serious obstacle. Several times I fell and had to struggle to get back up. But the fear of what might be following me kept me moving. I made it back to my truck just as the sun was setting. I'd never been so happy to see a vehicle in my life. I threw my gear in the back and drove out of there as fast as the icy roads would allow. It took me 2 days to work up the courage to tell anyone what had happened. I went to the emergency room first and told them I'd fallen while hiking. They set my shoulder and gave me pain medication, but I could tell they were suspicious about my story. A simple fall doesn't usually result in the kind of injuries I had. When I finally developed the photos, I couldn't believe how clear they were. You could see every detail of the creature, the hair, the facial features, even the expression in its eyes. But I also knew that no one would believe they were real. People would assume they were hoaxes or that I'd photographed someone in a costume. I've shown the pictures to a few close friends and the reactions have been mixed. Some believe me, Others think I'm either lying or that I saw something else and convinced myself it was the Bigfoot. But I know what I experienced out there, and I know what I photographed. I've thought about going back to the area to look for more evidence, but I honestly don't think I'd have the courage. The memory of that creature's face inches from mine, the sound of its roar, the feeling of complete helplessness. It's not something I ever want to experience again. People always ask me if I regret going on that trip, if I wish I'd never seen what I saw. The honest answer is that I don't know. Part of me wishes I could go back to believing that creatures like this don't exist. It would make sleeping at night a lot easier, but another part of me feels privileged to have witnessed something that most people will never see. There are things living in the remote wilderness that we don't understand, things that have managed to stay hidden from human civilization for centuries or maybe longer. The creature I encountered wasn't just some mindless beast. There was intelligence in its eyes, a sense of awareness that was almost human. It had built shelters, marked territory, and seemed to have a complex relationship with its environment. When it attacked me, it wasn't random violence. It was defending his home from what it saw as an intruder. I think about that creature sometimes, wonder if it's still living in that remote valley in the Selkirk Mountains. Part of me hopes it is, that it's found a way to continue existing without human interference. But another part of me worries about what might happen if more people venture into its territory. I still have the photographs I took that day. They're stored safely, and I've made multiple copies in case something happens to the originals. I've also documented everything I can remember about the encounter, from the footprints I found to the construction of the shelters to the exact location where the attack occurred. Some people have suggested I should share the photos with researchers or try to organize an expedition back to the area, but I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. This creature has managed to avoid human contact for who knows how long. Do I have the right to expose it to the world? For now, I'm keeping the exact location to myself. The general area is remote enough that casual hikers are unlikely to stumble across it, and I want to keep it that way. If the creature is still there, it deserves to live in peace. But I also think people should know that these things exist. We're not alone on this planet, and there are mysteries in the wilderness that we're only beginning to understand. The world is bigger and stranger than most of us realize. I know some people reading this will think I'm lying or delusional. I understand that. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I probably would have been skeptical too. All I can say is that I know what I experienced, and I have the photographs to prove it. The creature I encountered was real, intelligent, and powerful beyond anything I'd ever imagined. It could have killed me easily, but for whatever reason, it chose not to. I consider myself incredibly lucky to have survived the encounter with nothing more than a broken shoulder and some cuts and bruises. I still love hiking and spending time in the wilderness, but I'm much more careful now about where I go and how prepared I am. I carry better communication equipment, and I never venture into really remote areas alone anymore. The wilderness is beautiful and peaceful, but it's also home to things we don't understand. If you're planning any backcountry trips, especially in areas like the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, or other remote mountain regions, just be aware that you might not be alone out there. Pay attention to your surroundings, trust your instincts, and don't dismiss strange signs or sounds as just your imagination. I've included the 2 clearest photographs I took that day. Look at them carefully and decide for yourself what you think they show. But remember that somewhere out there, in the deepest parts of our remaining wilderness, there are creatures that have managed to stay hidden from human civilization for centuries. And maybe that's how it should stay. What I witnessed in those October woods of 1962 defies everything I thought I knew about the world. Even now, as I write these words with trembling hands, I can still hear the sounds, the bone-chilling howls, the thunderous crashes, the primal fury of two creatures locked in mortal combat. My name is Cole Dawson, and in October of 1962, I was 23 years old, naive as a newborn calf, and absolutely convinced that the world was about to end. Those were dark days. The Cold War wasn't just headlines, it was a suffocating dread that pressed down on every American's shoulders. We'd all seen the news back then, and we knew that somewhere across the ocean, the Soviets had their own arsenal of nuclear nightmares pointed straight at our hearts. Then came October 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis hit like a sledgehammer. Air raid sirens being tested in every major city. The whole damn world holding its breath, waiting to see if we'd all wake up the next morning or if civilization would end in a blinding flash of atomic fire. I remember sitting in my cramped Chicago apartment watching those grainy images of Soviet ships steaming toward Cuba and feeling something cold settle in my stomach. This was it. This was how it would all end. That's when I made the decision that would change my life forever. If the world was going to burn, if society was going to crumble into radioactive ash, then I needed to be ready. I needed to know how to survive when there were no grocery stores, no hospitals, no warm beds or electric lights. I needed to know how to live like our ancestors did, off the land, away from the cities that would be the first targets when the missiles started flying. So I started training. Every weekend, I'd drive out to the forests of Wisconsin and Illinois, learning to build shelters, start fires with flint and steel, identify edible plants, and track game. I read every survival manual I could get my hands on, studied the habits of predators, memorized the signs that meant danger was near. By October, I'd spent 6 months honing my skills in the relatively tame forests near the city. But that wasn't enough. If I was going to truly test myself, I needed to go deeper, farther, into places where the hand of man hadn't tamed the wild. That's how I found myself planning a solo expedition into the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota, near the Canadian border. It was a vast, trackless expanse of dense forest that stretched for hundreds of miles without a single road or settlement. The kind of place where a man could disappear forever and never be found. It was perfect. I set out on a crisp October morning, my pack loaded with the bare essentials, a few days' worth of food, basic camping gear, my grandfather's, revolver, and a well-worn copy of the Army Survival Manual. Everything else I'd need, I planned to make or find along the way. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The forest was magnificent, a cathedral of towering pines and ancient oaks. I made good time, covering nearly 15 miles before setting up camp in a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream. Using techniques I'd practiced dozens of times, I built a lean-to shelter, started a fire with flint and steel, and caught 3 brook trout for dinner. As I sat by my fire that night, watching the flames dance against the darkness and listening to the night sounds of the forest, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what I was meant to do. This was how humans were supposed to live, not huddled in concrete boxes, terrified of invisible threats, but free and self-reliant. The second day was even better. I woke before dawn and spent the morning foraging for edible plants and mushrooms. I found wild onions, late-blooming blackberries, and several varieties of mushrooms that I was confident were safe to eat. For lunch, I made a hearty stew combining the mushrooms and onions with jerky from my pack. That second night, I camped in a grove of massive white pines that must have been growing there for centuries. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars, I felt more alive than I had in months. Out here, the Cuban Missile Crisis seemed like something from another world. For the first time since those terrifying days in October had begun, I slept soundly. It was on the third day that everything began to change. I woke that morning with an odd feeling I couldn't quite place. a sense that something was different. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the normal dawn chorus of birds muted and subdued. Even the stream seemed to babble more softly, as if the very landscape was holding its breath. As I broke camp and resumed my journey deeper into the forest, the feeling only grew stronger. It was like an itch between my shoulder blades, a constant awareness that I was being observed by unseen eyes. I'd learned enough about woodcraft to know the signs of predators in the area. When a bear or mountain lion was nearby, the smaller animals went silent. Birds stopped singing, and even the insects seemed to quiet their buzzing. But this was different. This wasn't the respectful silence that prey animals showed to a known predator. This was something else entirely. Around midday, I stopped for lunch beside a small pond, its surface mirror smooth and reflecting the brilliant autumn foliage. As I sat on a fallen log eating cold jerky and wild berries, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, searching for whatever was causing this inexplicable sense of unease. That's when I saw them, the tracks. They were pressed deep into the soft mud at the water's edge, and at first glance I thought they might have been left by a man in bare feet. But as I knelt down for a closer look, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Each track was enormous, easily twice the length of my own size 10 boots, and proportionally wider. The toes were clearly defined, 5 of them like a human's, but longer and more ape-like, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The heel was massive and rounded, and the arch was so pronounced it left a clear gap in the middle of each print. But it was the stride length that really shook me. Whatever had made these tracks had been taking steps that were at least 4 feet apart, suggesting a creature of incredible size and leg length. I knelt there beside that peaceful pond, staring at those impossible tracks, and felt my carefully constructed worldview begin to crumble. I'd studied enough animal tracking to know that these prints didn't match any known species. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. But deep down, in the most primitive part of my brain where instinct lived, I knew I was looking at something real. Something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. I spent the rest of that afternoon in a state of heightened alertness, jumping at every sound and constantly checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now I knew why. Whatever had made those tracks was out there, somewhere in the dense forest around me, and it knew I was here. As evening approached, I selected my campsite with unusual care, choosing a small clearing that offered good visibility in all directions and positioning my shelter with its back against a large boulder. I built my fire larger than usual and gathered enough wood to keep it burning all night. But despite my precautions, sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig had me reaching for my gun and straining my eyes into the darkness. Several times throughout the night, I was certain I could see shapes moving between the trees. Massive, hulking silhouettes that seemed to be observing me from just beyond the edge of visibility. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, paranoid, and deeply shaken. But I was also more determined than ever to prove to myself that I could handle whatever challenges the wilderness might throw at me. How wrong I was. The 4th day brought a change in the weather that matched my increasingly dark mood. Heavy clouds had moved in during the night, blanketing the forest in a gray, oppressive gloom. The air was thick and humid, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain and something else. A musky animal odor that made my skin crawl every time I caught a whiff of it. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn back, to abandon this foolish expedition and return to the safety of civilization while I still could. But that would mean admitting defeat. It would mean accepting that I wasn't strong enough to survive on my own when the world came crashing down. So I pressed on, following a narrow game trail that wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the gray daylight could barely penetrate to the forest floor. It was around noon when I found the second set of tracks, I'd stopped beside a small stream to refill my water bottle when I noticed them pressed into the soft clay of the bank. These were different from the first set, smaller but somehow even more disturbing. They were roughly canine in shape, like the paw prints of a large dog or wolf, but wrong in ways that made my brain rebel against accepting what my eyes were seeing. For one thing, they were enormous. Each print was easily as large as a dinner plate, with claw marks that gouged deep furrows in the clay. But it was the shape that really unsettled me. The basic structure was all wrong for a quadruped. The prints were too elongated, too narrow, and the pad structure suggested something that walked more on its toes than on the flat of its feet. Most disturbing of all were the occasional prints that showed all 5 toes clearly defined, spread wide like the fingers of a hand. No wolf or dog had feet like that. As I knelt there studying those impossible prints, a horrible realization began to creep over me. The spacing between the tracks, the depth of the impressions, the way they seemed to follow the stream bank in a purposeful, intelligent pattern. This wasn't just some unknown animal wandering randomly through the forest. This thing, whatever it was hunting. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It started as a low rumble, so deep and resonant that I felt it in my chest as much as I heard it with my ears. It rose gradually in pitch and volume, becoming a howl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the song of wolves, which I'd heard many times during my wilderness training. This was something far more primal, far more threatening. It spoke of intelligence and malice, of a predator that killed not just for food, but for the sheer pleasure of the hunt. The howl seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the trees and rolling through the forest like thunder. As it finally faded away, leaving behind a silence so complete it was almost suffocating, I realized that every bird, every insect, every small animal in the forest had gone completely quiet. I was alone in the woods with something that even the wildlife feared. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to remain calm. Whatever was out there, running blindly through dense forest would only make me easier prey. I decided to change course, to head back toward civilization rather than continue deeper into the wilderness. But as I shouldered my pack and started back along the game trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. Something was watching me from the shadows between the trees, something that had been tracking my movements for days, learning my habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I was walking right into its trap. The next few hours were a nightmare of paranoia and barely controlled terror. As I made my way back along the increasingly familiar trails, the sensation of being followed grew stronger with every step. I could hear things moving in the forest around me, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the soft pad of footsteps that seemed to mirror my own pace. But whenever I stopped to listen more carefully, the sounds would stop too. Whenever I spun around to try to catch a glimpse of whatever was stalking me, I saw nothing but empty forest. The musky animal smell grew stronger as the afternoon wore on, carried on the humid air like a calling card from my unseen pursuer. It was a wild, primitive scent that spoke of something that had never known human civilization. By late afternoon, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in my peripheral vision had me spinning around with my hand on my gun. I was making too much noise, moving too fast, letting my fear override the careful woodcraft I'd spent months learning. As the sun began to set, I found myself approaching the clearing where I'd camped 2 nights before. I set up my shelter in the same spot, using the large boulder to protect my back and positioning my sleeping bag so I could see the entire clearing. I built my fire even larger than the previous night, creating a circle of light and warmth that I prayed would keep whatever was out there at bay. As darkness fell and the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, I sat with my back against the boulder, my revolver in my lap, and tried to convince myself that everything would be all right. But then, as the fire burned low and the shadows began to creep closer, I heard it again. The howl started the same way as before, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. But this time, it was closer, much closer. And as it rose in pitch and volume, filling the night air with its primal fury, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't alone. From somewhere to my left came an answering call, different in tone but equally terrifying. This one was higher in pitch, more aggressive, carrying a note of challenge that made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded almost like a wolf, but wrong in subtle ways that my brain couldn't quite process. The two sounds seemed to circle around my campsite, calling and answering each other in a pattern that suggested intelligence, communication, coordination. Whatever was out there, they were working together, and I was the focus of their attention. I added more wood to my fire with trembling hands, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The shadows between the trees seemed to be moving, shifting, coalescing into shapes that my terrified mind tried desperately to convince me weren't really there. That's when I saw the eyes. They appeared first as tiny pinpricks of reflected firelight, hovering in the darkness at the edge of my vision. The eyes were huge, easily 3 times the size of any normal animal's, and they glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. They were positioned too high off the ground to belong to any 4-legged creature, suggesting something that stood upright like a man but was far larger than any human had a right to be. As I stared in fascinated horror, the eyes moved, circling slowly around my campsite just at the edge of the firelight. I could catch glimpses of a massive shape behind them, something covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I raised my revolver with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold it steady, but I didn't fire. Something deep in my primitive brain was telling me that shooting now would be a mistake, that the only thing keeping me alive was the creature's curiosity. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we regarded each other across the dying fire. Predator and prey locked in a deadly standoff. The creature's eyes never left mine, studying me with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Finally, mercifully, the eyes began to move away, circling around behind my shelter and disappearing into the darkness beyond the boulder. But I could still hear it out there, moving through the forest with footsteps that were far too heavy to belong to any known animal. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat with my back against the boulder, feeding wood to the fire and listening to the sounds of something large moving through the darkness around me. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of those glowing eyes watching me from different positions. By the time dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, terrified, and more convinced than ever that I needed to get out of these woods before nightfall. Dawn came slowly to the forest, creeping through the canopy in gray, filtered light that did little to dispel the shadows or ease my terror. As the light grew stronger, I finally allowed myself to believe that I had survived another night. I broke camp quickly and efficiently, shouldering my pack and starting back along the trail that would take me out of this nightmare wilderness. My plan was simple. Hike hard and fast, covering as much ground as possible while the daylight lasted. But as I walked, following the increasingly familiar landmarks that marked my route back toward civilization, I began to notice something that made my blood run cold. There were more tracks now, pressed into the soft earth of the trail and the muddy banks of every stream I crossed. The massive bipedal prints I'd first discovered 3 days ago were everywhere, as if the creature that made them had been following my exact route through the forest. But now they were joined by the canine tracks I'd found beside the stream, dozens of them showing clear evidence that whatever made them had been running, moving with purpose and coordination. The implications were terrifying. Not only was I being stalked by 2 different creatures, but they seemed to be working together, coordinating their movements in a way that suggested intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple animal behavior. By midday, I was pushing myself harder than I had ever pushed before, driven by a primal terror that overwhelmed my exhaustion and hunger. I had to get out of these woods before whatever was stalking me decided that the game was over. But as I crested a small ridge and looked down into the valley below, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. In a small clearing beside the stream where I had first discovered those impossible footprints, two massive shapes were moving through the dappled sunlight. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing, tried to convince me that I was looking at bears or some other known wildlife. But as I crouched behind a fallen log and watched in fascinated horror, there was no denying the truth. The larger of the two creatures was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered from head to toe in thick, dark fur that seemed to absorb the sunlight. Its body was massively built, with shoulders that were broader than any human's and arms that hung down almost to its knees. But it was the face that truly marked it as something beyond nature, a blend of ape and human features that suggested intelligence lurking behind those dark, thoughtful eyes. But it was the second creature that truly made my blood freeze in my veins. Standing perhaps 6.5 feet tall on its hind legs, it was a nightmare fusion of wolf and man that seemed to have been pulled from the darkest folklore. Its body was lean and muscular, covered in coarse gray fur marked with darker patterns. The head was an elongated muzzle filled with gleaming fangs, pointed ears that swiveled constantly, and eyes that burned with a malevolent intelligence that was far too human for comfort. As I watched in paralyzed fascination, the two creatures seemed to be engaged in some kind of communication. The massive, ape-like being would make low, guttural sounds that carried an unmistakable tone of intelligence, while the wolf thing would respond with soft growls and barks that were far too complex for simple animal communication. They were talking, planning, coordinating their actions like a military unit preparing for an assault. And then, as if responding to some unheard signal, both creatures suddenly went still. Their heads turned in perfect unison toward my hiding place, and I realized with growing horror that they had detected my presence. The wolf creature's lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed fangs like ivory daggers, while the ape thing's massive hands slowly clenched into fists that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. Then the wolf thing threw back its head and released a howl that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. What happened next was so far beyond my comprehension that even now, more than 60 years later, I sometimes wonder if it was all just an exhaustion-induced hallucination. But the scars on my memory are too deep, too vivid to be anything but real. The wolf creature's howl had barely begun to fade when it launched itself across the clearing, with a speed and ferocity that defied belief. Its powerful legs propelled it through the air in a leap that covered nearly 20 feet, its claws extended and its jaws gaping wide to reveal those terrible fangs. But the massive ape thing was ready for the attack. With reflexes that seemed impossible for something so large, it stepped aside and brought one huge fist around in a devastating uppercut that caught the wolf creature in midair and sent it tumbling across the clearing to crash into a tree with a sound like thunder. For a moment, I thought the fight might be over before it had truly begun. The wolf creature lay crumpled at the base of the tree, its body twisted at an angle that suggested serious injury. But then it stirred, shook its massive head, and slowly climbed back to its feet with a snarl of pure rage. What followed was a battle that belonged in the realm of myth and legend. The two creatures circled each other like gladiators in some primordial arena, each looking for an opening, an advantage, a moment of weakness they could exploit. The ape thing had size and strength on its side, its massive frame and powerful muscles allowing it to deliver blows that would have killed any normal animal instantly. But the wolf creature was faster, more agile, and possessed claws and fangs that could inflict terrible damage even on its larger opponent. They came together again and again in a series of violent clashes that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The wolf creature would dart in, raking its claws across the ape thing's massive chest or attempting to sink its fangs into its throat, only to be met with a blow from one of those huge fists that would send it flying across the clearing. But each time the wolf creature was knocked down, it would get back up, more savage and determined than before. Blood began to flow from wounds on both combatants, bright red against the dark fur of the ape thing, darker where it matted the gray coat of the wolf creature. The sounds they made during the battle were unlike anything I had ever heard. The ape thing roared with a voice that shook the leaves from the trees, a sound that spoke of primordial rage and territorial fury. The wolf creature responded with howls and snarls that seemed to come from the very depths of nightmare. As the battle raged on, I began to realize that this was about more than just two predators fighting over territory. There was history here, old hatred and rivalry that ran deeper than simple animal competition. These creatures knew each other, had fought before, and the violence between them was personal. The turning point came when the wolf creature managed to get behind its larger opponent and leap onto its back, sinking its fangs deep into the thick muscles of the ape thing's neck. For a moment, it looked as though the battle might be over, but the ape thing was far from finished. With a roar of pain and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, it reached back with both massive hands and grabbed the wolf creature by the scruff of its neck. What happened next was a display of raw physical power that defied belief. The ape thing lifted its opponent clear off its back and, with a motion that was almost casual in its devastating efficiency, hurled the wolf creature through the air like a rag doll. The wolf creature's body struck a massive oak tree with such force that I could hear bones breaking from my hiding place 50 yards away. This time, when the wolf creature hit the ground, it didn't get back up immediately. It lay there for long seconds, its chest rising and falling with labored breathing, dark blood pooling beneath its massive head. The ape thing seemed to think the fight was over. Instead of pressing its advantage, it stood in the center of the clearing, breathing heavily and examining its wounds. Deep gashes from the wolf creature's claws crisscrossed its chest and arms, and there was a particularly nasty bite wound on its neck where dark blood was flowing freely. But then, with a sudden burst of speed that caught even the massive ape thing off guard, the wolf creature sprang back to its feet and launched itself in a desperate final attack. This time, instead of trying to grapple with its larger opponent, it went straight for the kill, leaping high into the air with its jaws gaping wide, aiming for the ape thing's throat. For a split second, it looked as though the attack might succeed. The wolf creature's fangs were mere inches from the ape thing's neck when those massive hands shot up and caught it in midair. What followed was a brief, violent struggle as the two creatures grappled for position. But the ape thing's superior size and strength finally told. With a final, tremendous effort, it managed to get both hands around the wolf creature's throat and began to squeeze. The wolf creature thrashed and clawed desperately, but its struggles grew weaker as the life was slowly crushed out of it. I thought I was about to witness the death of one of these impossible creatures when something unexpected happened. The ape thing, perhaps realizing that its opponent was on the verge of death, suddenly released its grip and stepped back. The wolf creature collapsed to the ground, gasping and choking, but still alive. For a long moment, the two creatures stared at each other across the torn and bloodied clearing. Then, without warning, the ape thing turned and walked away. It didn't run, didn't flee in panic. It simply turned its back on its defeated opponent and disappeared into the dense forest with a dignity that was almost human in its restraint. The wolf creature remained where it had fallen for several more minutes, gradually recovering its strength. When it finally managed to stand, it looked around the clearing with what seemed like confusion. Then it too limped away into the forest, moving in the opposite direction from the one the ape thing had taken. And suddenly I was alone. For several minutes after both creatures had vanished into the forest, I remained crouched behind my fallen log, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. My mind was reeling from what I'd witnessed, struggling to process the impossible reality of what had just occurred. I had just watched two creatures that shouldn't exist engage in a battle that belonged in the realm of mythology. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world had been shattered in the space of a few violent minutes. But as the minutes passed and neither creature returned, I began to realize that this might be my only chance to escape. I needed to get out of these woods, and I needed to do it now. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept out from behind my hiding place and began to make my way around the edge of the clearing. The evidence of the battle was everywhere. Torn earth, broken branches, pools of dark blood that gleamed wetly in the filtered sunlight. As I reached the far side of the clearing and prepared to plunge back into the forest, I made the mistake of looking back. There, pressed deep into the soft earth near where the wolf creature had fallen, was a single footprint that made my blood turn to ice. It was human, or at least it was close enough to human to be unmistakable. But it was wrong in subtle ways. Too long, too narrow, with claw marks at the tips of the toes that no human foot should possess. The wolf creature, I realized with growing horror, could walk upright when it chose to. And when it did, its feet left prints that could easily be mistaken for those of a very large, very strange human being. I turned away from that terrible footprint and plunged into the forest, no longer caring about stealth or woodcraft. All that mattered now was distance, putting as much space as possible between myself and this cursed place where impossible things stalked through the shadows. I ran through those woods like a man possessed, crashing through underbrush and splashing across streams without regard for the noise I was making. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots caught at my feet, and more than once I stumbled and fell, only to scramble back to my feet and continue my desperate flight. As the hours passed and the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion started to take its toll. But I forced myself to keep moving, driven by a terror that transcended mere physical discomfort. It was late in the afternoon when I finally stumbled out of the dense forest and found myself standing on the shore of a lake I recognized. I had made it back to within a few miles of where I had started my expedition 5 days earlier. But as I stood there on the muddy shore, gasping for breath and trying to process everything that had happened, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was distant, barely audible over the lapping of waves against the shore, but unmistakable. A howl, long, mournful, and filled with an intelligence that no natural wolf should possess. It was coming from the forest behind me, and it was getting closer. I didn't wait to see what might emerge from the trees. Summoning strength I didn't know I still possessed, I plunged into the cold water of the lake and began swimming toward the far shore. The weight of my waterlogged pack threatened to drag me under, but I didn't dare abandon it. My grandfather's revolver was still inside. The swim across that lake was one of the longest of my life, even though it couldn't have been more than a quarter of a mile. Every stroke was an agony of exhausted muscles and burning lungs. But somehow I made it to the far shore and dragged myself up onto the rocky beach. I lay there for several precious minutes, coughing up lake water and trying to summon the will to continue, when I heard something that made my heart stop. Splashing, coming from the direction of the far shore. I forced myself to look back across the water, and there, silhouetted against the setting sun, I could see a massive shape moving through the water toward me. It was swimming with powerful, purposeful strokes that covered the distance far faster than any human could manage. The wolf creature had followed me into the lake. I struggled to my feet and began running again, this time along a hiking trail that I knew would take me back to the parking area where I had left my car 5 days earlier. Behind me, I could hear the creature reaching the shore, could hear the sound of water streaming from its massive body as it pulled itself up onto the rocks. But I also heard something else, labored breathing, the sound of an animal that was badly injured and running on nothing but determination and predatory instinct. The battle with the ape thing had taken its toll. That realization gave me hope. If I could just stay ahead of it for another mile or two, if I could reach my car before it caught up with me, I might actually survive this nightmare. The trail wound through increasingly familiar territory, past landmarks I remembered from my journey into the wilderness. As twilight began to fall and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I could see the glow of electric lights in the distance. The small town where I'd left my car. I was almost there, almost safe. But as I crested the final hill and saw the parking area spread out below me, empty except for my dusty sedan, I heard the wolf creature howl again. This time it was close, very close. And there was something different about the sound, something that spoke of desperation and dying fury rather than confident predation. I reached my car just as the creature emerged from the tree line 50 yards behind me. In the pale light of the rising moon, I could see that it was badly injured. Its gait was unsteady, dark blood matted its gray fur, and one of its arms hung at an odd angle. But it was still coming, still determined to finish what it had started in those dark woods. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the lock. Behind me, I could hear the creature's labored breathing getting closer, could hear its claws clicking against the asphalt. Finally, mercifully, the door opened, and I threw myself into the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the first try, and I gunned it out of the parking lot just as the wolf creature reached the car. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it standing in the middle of the road, watching me flee with those terrible, intelligent eyes. Then I rounded a curve and it was gone, lost in the darkness behind me. I drove through the night like a man possessed, not stopping until I reached the outskirts of Minneapolis as dawn was breaking over the highway. Only then did I finally allow myself to believe that I had escaped. But as I sat in a truck stop diner, mechanically eating eggs and bacon while trying to process everything that had happened, I realized that telling this tale was going to be a problem. Who would believe such a story? Who would accept that a young man from Chicago had witnessed a battle between a Sasquatch and what could only be described as a werewolf? I thought about my friends back home, about their reactions when I told them I was going into the wilderness to prepare for nuclear war. They had thought I was crazy then. What would they think if I came back with stories of monster battles? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that silence was the only option. Whatever those creatures were, wherever they had come from, they had earned the right to live their lives in peace, free from human interference. So I kept my mouth shut. I went back to Chicago, back to my job and my apartment and my normal life. I watched the Cuban Missile Crisis resolve itself without nuclear war. And I tried to convince myself that none of it had really happened, but the memories wouldn't fade. Night after night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing again those terrible howls echoing through the darkness. I would see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows, would feel again that primal terror of being hunted by something that viewed humans as prey. Years passed, decades. The Cold War ended, the world changed, technology advanced. But somehow, those deep woods of northern Minnesota remained as mysterious and untouched as they had been in 1962. Occasionally, I would see stories in the news about Bigfoot sightings or werewolf encounters, usually dismissed as hoaxes or hallucinations. I would read the accounts with a mixture of recognition and sadness, knowing that somewhere out there were other people who had glimpsed the truth and found themselves unable to share it. Sometimes I wondered if I should have tried harder to tell my story, should have fought to make people believe. But then I would remember the intelligence in those creatures' eyes, the way they had seemed to communicate with each other, and I would know that I had made the right choice. Some secrets are meant to be kept, some truths are too dangerous to share, and some encounters with the unknown are meant to remain forever locked away in the deepest corners of human memory. Now, as I write these words in the twilight of my life, I can finally tell this story. Most of the people who might have been tempted to mount expeditions into those dark woods are long dead, and the creatures themselves have probably moved on to even more remote territories. I'm 85 years old, and the cancer is winning its war against my body. Soon, very soon, I'll be gone, and this story will die with me unless I find the courage to share it. So here it is, The truth about what happened in those dark woods of northern Minnesota in October of 1962. I've changed nothing, added nothing, hidden nothing. This is exactly what I saw, exactly what I experienced, exactly what has haunted my dreams for more than 60 years. I don't expect anyone to believe it. I wouldn't believe it myself if someone else told me such a story. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real. And I know that somewhere out there in the deep places of the world, impossible things still walk beneath the stars. The Cuban Missile Crisis passed without nuclear war. The world didn't end in atomic fire. But for me, in those woods, something ended anyway. My naive faith that humans understood the world we lived in, that we had cataloged and classified everything that mattered, that we were the only intelligent life on this planet. I learned that we share our world with older things, stranger things, things that have learned to avoid us and our cities and our increasingly intrusive technology. They live in the spaces between our mapped territories, in the shadows of our surveillance, in the silence between our radio signals. And sometimes, very rarely, a human being stumbles into their world and glimpses truths that weren't meant for human eyes. I was one of those humans. For 5 days in October 1962, I walked in a world where legends were real and monsters fought their ancient battles beneath the autumn stars. I survived that encounter, but I was forever changed by it. Now, as my time runs short, I leave this record for whoever might find it. Take from it what you will, believe it or dismiss it as the ravings of a dying old man. But remember this, the world is stranger and more wonderful and more terrible than we imagine. And in the deep woods, where the old rules still apply and civilization is just a distant memory, impossible things still walk the earth. For more interesting stories like this, check this one out.